In this video, we take you on an emotional roller coaster love story, where past wounds can't stop love from growing over time. Join us on the journey of Alex and Ryan, from heartbreak, conflict, to their rebirth and healing in their relationship. Will love be strong enough to overcome every challenge? And can they find lasting happiness? These are the questions we'll explore in this video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to Stories TH channel to never miss any touching stories. A cloudy, lonely beginning. Alex Miller's life had always felt like it was suspended somewhere between two worlds, the one she had built and the one she wished she could leave behind. At 29, Alex had already experienced more heartache than most people did in a lifetime. Raised in a small town in Northern Carolina, her early years were filled with the sort of gentle simplicity that could lull a person into a sense of security. But life had a different plan for her. Her parents had always been kind but distant, and though she never lacked for anything material, there had always been a subtle absence of warmth. That distance between them had been the first crack in her foundation. As a young adult, she sought to fill that void in a way that only people who are looking for love in the wrong places can. She married young at 24, hoping that a promise of forever would somehow erase the emptiness she felt. But like so many things in her life, the marriage was a beautiful illusion. It started with passion, hope, and a sense of belonging. But it ended with betrayal, silence, and a year of therapy that couldn't undo the damage. By the time Alex had reached 29, her heart had learned to guard itself in ways that she never thought it could. She had become a master of self-preservation, even if that meant shutting out everyone around her. Now, in the dim quiet of her life, there was only the constant hum of self-doubt, which she kept at bay through books, art, and long walks that no one could interrupt. The heartbreak from her failed marriage still haunted her, sometimes in the form of old songs she couldn't listen to without tearing up, and other times in the quiet of her apartment when the world outside was loud with life. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, a city that was big enough to offer anonymity, but small enough that you'd still run into someone you knew at the coffee shop. The house, modest and worn, had been a refuge for nothing fancy, just a place to hide from the world. The walls, painted in soft shades of white and beige, were lined with shelves full of secondhand books from the used bookstore where she worked. Her modest job allowed her enough time to escape into the pages of novels and journals, pouring her heart out in her private diary. Painting was her only other escape. She was hardly a renowned artist, but painting allowed her to express the chaos in her soul in a way words never could. There were days when it felt as if the world was passing her by, days when she stared out of her window at the busy streets of Charlotte, her thoughts clouded with a mix of fear and longing. Alex had not fully healed from her past, and sometimes she questioned whether healing was even possible. But she still held on to the belief that somewhere, somehow, there was a future waiting for her, a future that she could build with her own hands. Her life was simple, perhaps too simple for someone who had spent most of their 20s dreaming of something more. But simplicity offered comfort, even if it came with loneliness. Then, one fateful evening, as the golden sun dipped behind the horizon and the bookstore was about to close, a stranger walked into her world. His name was Ryan Carter, and he was everything she was not: rich, successful, and completely self-assured. At first glance, he was the kind of man who seemed impervious to the trials of life, a man whose very presence commanded attention. Ryan was 35, a businessman with a reputation that preceded him. Tall, impeccably dressed, and with an air of quiet confidence, he looked like the type of person who belonged in boardrooms, not quaint little bookstores. But there he was, browsing the shelves as though he had all the time in the world. He didn't seem like the typical customer. Alex had grown used to people who came in to pick up their favorite novels, talk about the weather, or gossip about their day. Ryan's eyes were distant, his expression unreadable. He wandered through the aisles, glancing at the spines of books, but never really picking anything up. Alex had watched him for a while, instinctively sensing that there was something different about him, something deeper and more complicated than the surface he showed the world. She had no idea why, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she found herself walking over to him. "Can I help you find something?" Alex asked, her voice soft, almost tentative. Ryan looked up, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was a flicker of recognition, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't a warm smile or a pleasant greeting. Instead, it was as if he saw something in her that reminded him of a memory he had long buried. "No, I'm just browsing," he replied, his voice deep and smooth, almost as if he had rehearsed the answer 1,000 times. He turned his attention back to the shelf in front of him, his face unreadable. Alex didn't press him further, instead choosing to watch him from a distance. The truth was, she didn't know why she felt drawn to him. He was nothing like the kind of man she usually found intriguing, too polished, too perfect. But there was something about his air of solitude, his unspoken sadness, that mirrored her own. Days passed, and Ryan continued to visit the bookstore, always around the same time in the evening, always with the same air of detachment. He would pick up a book, glance at the cover, and put it back. He never stayed long, but each time he came in, Alex found herself waiting for him. It was as though their lives, though seemingly worlds apart, were colliding in small, inconspicuous moments. Eventually, Ryan spoke to her again. One evening, just before closing time, he picked up a book by a local author and brought it to the counter. As Alex scanned it, their hands brushed lightly, an unspoken connection that neither of them acknowledged. "Do you ever wonder if it's all worth it?" Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His question wasn't directed at her, but more to the world around them. Alex was caught off guard by the sudden vulnerability in his tone, a sharp contrast to the self-assurance he usually wore like armor. She met his gaze, her heart skipping a beat. For the first time, she saw the pain behind his eyes that had been closed off for so long, eyes that had learned to shield themselves from the world's harshness. "Sometimes," she replied quietly, "I think the only way to find out is to keep going." Ryan nodded slowly, as if her words were the missing piece he had been looking for. "I've spent too much time running from it," he said, almost to himself. "Maybe it's time I stop." Their eyes locked for a moment longer than usual, and for that brief instant, Alex felt as if she had known him for years. She didn't know what it was, whether it was the shared loneliness in the air between them or the unspoken understanding, but something about Ryan made her feel less alone in the world. A serendipitous meeting. The art exhibition was a place Alex had come to know well, her little escape from the quiet world of the bookstore and the solitary routines she had grown accustomed to. It was an event that took place once a year in the heart of Charlotte, bringing together artists from all corners of the city. For Alex, it was an opportunity to showcase her work and, perhaps more importantly, to connect with people who shared her love for art. She never expected her paintings to be displayed in galleries or to make a fortune from her artwork, but the exhibition was something that allowed her to express herself in a way that words never could. That evening, Alex's booth was tucked in a corner, near a window that offered a perfect view of the fading sunlight casting soft, golden hues over her work. Her paintings, often abstract and filled with dark, muted tones, were a reflection of the emotions she had long kept hidden. The pieces depicted various themes of isolation, figures tangled in shadows, a lone tree standing against a stormy sky, and most prominently, an image of a woman standing in the middle of a bustling city, yet completely alone, dwarfed by the towering buildings around her. The painting was an almost eerily accurate representation of Alex's own life, a reflection of how, despite her outward appearance, she always felt disconnected, unable to truly find her place in the world. As she stood next to her paintings, quietly observing the people walking by, she noticed a tall man slowly approaching her booth. At first, she didn't pay him much attention. After all, this was a crowded event, and people would come and go without saying much. But there was something about the way he lingered in front of her most recent piece that caught her eye. His gaze was intense, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to decode a mystery hidden within the strokes of the painting. It didn't take long for Alex to realize that this wasn't just any visitor. The man, dressed in a dark tailored suit, had an air of quiet authority about him, though his expression was thoughtful and contemplative, not the type of demeanor one would expect from a businessman. She stood still for a moment, waiting for him to speak, unsure of how to break the silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned to her, his voice soft yet steady. "This piece," he began, nodding toward the painting, "it speaks to something deeper. The loneliness in this figure, surrounded by so many others but still so isolated, it's striking." Alex hesitated, taken aback by the depth of his response. Most people who looked at her work simply nodded or made polite comments, but this man seemed to understand the emotion she had tried to convey. For a moment, their eyes locked, and she felt as though he saw something in her, something vulnerable that no one else had ever noticed before. "Thank you," Alex replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She was unsure of how to respond. This was the kind of praise she had always wanted but never really received. It wasn't just about the technicality of the art. It was about understanding the raw emotions beneath the surface. Ryan stood there for a moment longer, clearly absorbed in the painting, before finally stepping back to take in the full view of the booth. "I don't usually attend these kinds of events," he admitted, a faint smile playing on his lips. "But there's something about your work that drew me in." Alex smiled politely, though she couldn't quite suppress the sense of curiosity that stirred within her. It wasn't every day that someone so distinguished took an interest in her art. "I'm glad you like it," she said, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the table in front of her. "It's just something I've been working on for a while. It's personal, in a way." Ryan's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to read her. There was an air of mystery about him, something that made Alex feel as though she were speaking to someone who had lived through experiences that were far different from her own. "I understand," he said, his voice a bit more measured. I think everyone has their own version of loneliness. We live in a world that's always connected, always moving, yet so many people feel more isolated than ever." Alex blinked, surprised by his insight. It wasn't the kind of remark she would expect from a businessman, someone who probably spent most of his time negotiating deals or running companies. Yet there was an authenticity in his words that made her pause. "I suppose you're right," she replied softly, her mind racing with thoughts of how often she had felt that same disconnection. "It's funny how, even with all the noise around us, we can still feel so alone." Ryan's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Alex could see a flicker of something in his eyes, an understanding that went beyond the surface. It was as if, in that brief exchange, they had both shared something personal, something raw, without even meaning to. For the next few minutes, they continued to talk at first about the paintings, but then about other things. They spoke of life, of the way people's paths often crossed unexpectedly, of the disillusionment that comes with ambition, and the emptiness that so often follows success. Alex found herself drawn into the conversation more than she had expected, her usual reserved nature melting away in the warmth of his company. Despite the distance that she had built around herself over the years, there was something about Ryan that felt familiar, as if they were two strangers who had known each other for a lifetime. As the exhibition came to a close, the crowd began to thin out, and Alex started packing up her things. To her surprise, Ryan lingered, watching her quietly for a moment before stepping forward. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking. You're an incredibly talented artist, Alex. But it seems like you're also stuck. Like there's something more that you're capable of, but you're not quite sure how to get there." Alex's heart skipped a beat. She had always been the type to shy away from compliments, especially when they felt too genuine. But there was something about Ryan's words that made her feel both seen and exposed at the same time. "Stuck?" she repeated, unsure of how to respond. Ryan nodded slowly. "You don't have to answer that right now, but I have a feeling there's more to your story than what you're willing to show." Alex opened her mouth to respond, but before she could find the words, Ryan continued. "I want to help you, not just with your art, but with your life. I think you have a lot to offer, and I think you've been holding yourself back for too long." Alex stood frozen, her mind racing. She had never met anyone who had offered to help her so freely, let alone someone who seemed to have everything he could possibly need. The offer was both unexpected and overwhelming. She began, but Ryan raised a hand to stop her. "No need to respond right away," he said. "Think about it. I know this may sound strange, but I believe in your potential. I'm not one to offer help lightly, but something tells me you're someone worth investing in." With that, Ryan turned and walked away, leaving Alex standing there, her mind reeling. She had never expected to meet someone like him, someone who could read between the lines of her life, who could see the parts of her she had buried so deep. And yet, in that fleeting encounter, she had felt something shift. Something had changed, and for the first time in a long time, Alex felt as if her future might not be as hopeless as it once seemed. The growing connection. Over the next few weeks, Alex and Ryan's paths continued to cross in unexpected ways. What began as a chance encounter at the art exhibition gradually blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated. Ryan, despite his reluctance to engage with others, found himself drawn to Alex, not only because of her art, but because of her quiet resilience. He admired her independence, the way she carried herself even when she was clearly broken inside. Alex, on the other hand, was more hesitant. Having been burned by trust before, she couldn't bring herself to open up to Ryan completely. Her experiences in love had made her wary of men who appeared to be too good to be true. She'd been down that road before her ex-husband had seemed like the perfect partner, only to reveal his true self after they were married. The betrayal had shattered her, and now, with Ryan, she couldn't help but wonder, was he just like everyone else? At first, their meetings were casual, brief coffee dates, small talks about art, and occasional messages checking in with each other. The conversations flowed easily, but there was always an invisible barrier between them. Alex kept her guard up, careful not to reveal too much about herself. Ryan, likewise, was reserved. Though he could be charming, he never fully let his walls down, afraid that showing any sign of vulnerability would make him appear weak. Beneath his polished exterior was a man haunted by his past, a past full of disappointment and loss that he preferred not to revisit. But despite their differences, there was an undeniable pull between them. Ryan found himself looking forward to their time together, the quiet moments when he could sit across from her, the soft light from the cafe window casting a warm glow over her face. There was something about Alex that made him feel lighter, like he could breathe easier around her. For the first time in years, he began to question whether it was possible to let someone in again. Alex, too, felt an attraction, though she was careful not to admit it to herself. She appreciated Ryan's gentleness, how he never pushed her beyond what she was comfortable with. But there was something else, something deeper, a connection that transcended their surface-level interactions. She couldn't quite explain it, but she felt safe with him, even though she was still hesitant to trust fully. Despite their growing connection, there were moments when Alex would catch herself pulling away, subconsciously keeping him at arm's length. She hadn't forgotten the way her ex-husband had promised her the world, only to tear it all apart. She couldn't allow herself to become vulnerable again, not so soon. Ryan, on the other hand, was aware of this. He could see the wall she had built around herself, and while he respected her space, it only made him want to help her more. Then came the day when everything changed. It had been a particularly stressful week for Alex. The bookstore where she worked had recently undergone some financial strain, and her paycheck, as usual, barely covered the bills. She had been trying to make ends meet, juggling late-night shifts and cutting down on unnecessary expenses. But despite her best efforts, her bank account was in the red, and she had no way of making up the difference. The anxiety gnawed at her as she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills in front of her, feeling more defeated than she ever had before. She had considered reaching out to her parents, but pride kept her from doing so. Her relationship with them had always been distant, and she didn't want to burden them with her problems. She had learned long ago that she had to rely on herself, even if it meant carrying the weight of the world alone. It was then that she received a message from Ryan. It was a simple text, just asking how she was doing, but something about it struck her as odd. She had gotten used to their usual light conversations, but today his message felt different. "I know this might be an odd question," the text read, "but would you like to meet up for lunch? I think you could use a break." Alex hesitated before replying. She wasn't sure if she was ready to open up, but there was something about Ryan's words that felt genuine. She agreed to meet him at a local cafe, though she still had no idea what he was thinking. They had never been overly personal with one another, so she wasn't sure why he seemed to be offering support now. When she arrived at the cafe, Ryan was already waiting. He greeted her with his usual calm smile, but today, there was a different energy about him. As they sat down and ordered their food, Alex found herself nervously twisting her napkin in her hands. She was trying to figure out how to steer the conversation to safer topics, but Ryan had other plans. "Alex," he began, his voice steady yet warm, "I've noticed you've been a little off lately. I know you're used to doing things on your own, but I can't help but feel like you're carrying more than you should." Alex looked up at him, surprised by his perceptiveness. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. Ryan didn't press further. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his gaze steady but non-judgmental. There was an understanding in his eyes, something that made Alex feel both seen and understood. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel alone in her struggle. "Listen," Ryan said after a pause, "I know we've only known each other for a short time, but I want to help. I don't know what you're going through, but if there's anything I can do, I'm here for you." No strings attached. Alex's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected this from him. Here was a man who, despite all his own reservations, was offering her help without asking for anything in return. It wasn't just the money, though. God, did she need it, but it was the fact that Ryan was offering something much more valuable, his genuine care. I don't know what to say," Alex stammered, the weight of his words sinking in. "I've always managed to get by, but right now, it's just hard." Ryan smiled gently. "You don't have to do everything alone, Alex. Let me help." In that moment, something inside her shifted. She had always prided herself on being independent, on handling everything by herself. But for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, it was okay to let someone in. "I'd appreciate that," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't think I'd ever ask for help, but I think I need it." Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with empathy. "You don't have to ask for anything. Consider this just a friend offering a hand." It was in that moment that Alex felt a deeper connection to Ryan than she had ever expected. It wasn't about the money or the help, it was about trust. And for the first time in a long while, Alex felt that she wasn't alone. Here's the expanded version of your fourth part, keeping it engaging and ensuring it flows smoothly. The focus is on the conflict and the emotional challenges both characters face, with an emphasis on building tension and keeping the reader hooked. The first crisis, challenge and doubt. Things have been going well between Alex and Ryan. After the day he helped her with the financial issues, their bond seemed to deepen, and for the first time in a long time, Alex allowed herself to trust him. She had started to think that maybe, just maybe, she could find love again. Ryan was everything she had longed for, a man who was kind, thoughtful, and, despite his distance, showed a side of himself she could connect with. But, as with all good things, there was an undercurrent of doubt she couldn't shake. She still wondered, deep down, whether she was being foolish. Could someone like Ryan, successful, driven, and always in control, really care about someone like her? It was during this time of uncertainty that Ryan's world took an unexpected turn. One Monday morning, as Alex was getting ready for her shift at the bookstore, Ryan received a call that would change everything. His phone buzzed, vibrating on a coffee table. The name on the screen flashed. Ethan Daniels, his business partner. Ryan had always prided himself on keeping a balance between his professional and personal life, but this call was different. "Ryan," Ethan's voice crackled on the other end, "I need you to come in. We've got a major opportunity on the table, and it's time-sensitive. We're talking millions here. If we don't act fast, we'll lose it to the competition." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The project was everything they had worked for, a chance to break into a new market that had the potential to catapult his company to new heights. Ethan had been pushing for this for months, but it had always been on the back burner until now. This project was no longer just an opportunity. It had become a necessity, one that would define his career for years to come. But there was one major problem. The project was scheduled to take place in the coming weeks, right at the same time as the exhibition where Alex will be showcasing her new collection of paintings. It was a huge event for her, one that she had been looking forward to for months. They had discussed it a few times, and she had made it clear how important it was to her. Ryan had promised he would be there to support her, and he knew she was counting on him. The thought of breaking that promise, of letting her down, gnawed at him. He paused, torn between his ambition and his growing feelings for Alex. There was a fire inside him, an undeniable drive that had been cultivated over years of hard work, but something about Alex made him want to stay grounded. He had come to value their time together, and the last thing he wanted was to jeopardize what they had. But as Ethan's voice came through the phone again, more insistent this time, Ryan made a decision. "I'll do it," he said, trying to mask the hesitation in his voice. "I'll be there." Ryan didn't tell Alex about the project. He didn't want to burden her with the stress of the decision, especially knowing how much it would hurt her. He had convinced himself that he could handle both his work and his relationship after all. He had done it before, hadn't he? But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. The weight of this new opportunity pressed on him, and he began to prioritize it over everything else. For the next few days, Ryan became increasingly distant. He buried himself in meetings, phone calls, and late-night strategy sessions with Ethan, trying to keep the project under wraps while still maintaining his relationship with Alex. But the more he immersed himself in the business, the more strained his interactions with her became. He wasn't as attentive as he had been before, and Alex began to notice. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day at the bookstore, Alex returned home to find a text from Ryan. He had promised to meet her for dinner, but the message was short and vague. "Sorry, something came up. Let's talk tomorrow." Alex frowned at the screen, confusion creeping into her mind. It wasn't like him to cancel plans without an explanation. She waited until the next day, hoping that Ryan would open up about why he had been so distant. But when he finally showed up, he was unusually quiet. They sat across from each other at a small cafe, and though the atmosphere was cozy, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," Alex began, trying to break the tension. "You've been acting different lately. We've barely talked in the past few days, and you're always busy. Is everything okay?" Ryan looked at her, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He had become so accustomed to hiding his personal struggles from others, especially Alex, that the words didn't come easily. Instead, he took a deep breath and tried to deflect the conversation. "It's just work, Alex. You know how it is," he said, avoiding her gaze. "There's a lot going on right now. I've just been caught up in everything." Alex could feel the distance between them growing, like a wall was slowly being built. Her instinct screamed that something wasn't right, but she didn't want to push him too hard. Maybe it was just the stress, she thought. But as the days passed, the distance only grew wider, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was keeping something from her. Then, the bombshell dropped. One evening, while Alex was out with a friend, she overheard a conversation at a bar that made her stomach drop. A familiar name popped up: Ryan Carter. The conversation was casual at first, but then the topic shifted to a new business deal, and Alex froze when she heard one of the speakers mention Ryan's involvement in a major project that was happening at the same time as the exhibition. The details were vague, but the mention of millions of dollars in a time-sensitive opportunity left no room for doubt. Her heart pounded in her chest as the truth hit her. Ryan had been keeping secrets from her. He hadn't told her about the project, not because it was unimportant, but because he didn't want to share the pressure he was under. And worse yet, he had chosen work over her, choosing not to confide in her when she needed him the most. Alex felt her world crumble as a wave of betrayal washed over her. The man she had started to trust, the man she thought was different, had just proven that he was no better than the others who had disappointed her in the past. She couldn't shake the feeling of being used, of being nothing more than an afterthought in his life. That night, she confronted Ryan. The conversation was heated, filled with accusations and hurtful words. She demanded an explanation, but he couldn't give her one. He had been too consumed by the project, too focused on his own ambitions to see the damage he was causing. "I thought we were different, Ryan," Alex said, tears welling in her eyes. "I thought you cared about me, but now I see it was all just a lie." Ryan stood there, speechless, watching her walk away, knowing that he had just lost the one person who truly mattered to him. For the first time in his life, he realized that no amount of business success could make up for the emptiness he now felt. The next few days were filled with silence. Neither of them reached out to the other, each consumed by their own thoughts and emotions. The rift between them had grown too wide, and for the moment, it seemed that nothing could repair the damage. Would they find their way back to each other, or was this the end of something that could have been beautiful? Neither knew, but the weight of their choices hung heavy in the air. Here is the expanded version of your fifth part, written to keep the reader engaged and ensure the emotional depth of the characters is well developed. This section focuses on the pain both characters feel and their choices moving forward. The second crisis, the pain and the decision to break up. The days that followed Ryan's departure were filled with a kind of numbness that Alex hadn't experienced in a long time. The familiar ache of loneliness, which she had so desperately tried to escape, crept back into her life like a shadow that refused to leave. She had known, deep down, that something was off between them, that Ryan had been pulling away. But she had hoped believed that their connection was stronger than anything else, that would overcome the obstacles life had thrown at them. Yet, in the end, it wasn't enough. Ryan's absence left a gaping hole in her heart, one she had tried to fill with her art, with her work, and with the faint hope that time would heal the wounds. But nothing could replace what she had lost. Alex stood by the window one evening, staring at the empty street below, the familiar rush of traffic sounding distant and muted. The city around her felt the same, but it didn't feel like home anymore. The world, once so full of possibilities, now seemed painfully indifferent. As the days turned into weeks, Alex realized that she had fallen back into her old patterns. She was pulling away from everyone, becoming more isolated. But this time, there was no one around to comfort her, no family to lean on, no friends to catch her when she stumbled. She felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, teetering on the brink of a fall into a void that could consume her completely. The loneliness was suffocating, but it was also strangely familiar. It was a feeling she knew all too well, a feeling she had tried so hard to outrun. But Alex refused to be consumed by the past. She couldn't afford to stay trapped in her own despair, not again. She had made a promise to herself years ago when she first left her ex-husband she would never let anyone take away her sense of self-worth again. She wouldn't allow herself to be defined by the mistakes or betrayals of others. So, she made a decision, a bold decision. She quit her job at the bookstore, a place she had come to think of as a prison of memories. It had once been a haven, a place where she had found solace in the pages of forgotten stories. But now, every time she walked through the door, it felt like a weight on her chest, a reminder of all the things she had lost. So she left, packing up her things and walking out with nothing but the determination to start new. Alex didn't stop there. She knew she had to get away from everything that reminded her of the life she had been living. Ryan, the bookstore, the city that had once felt like home. So, without a second thought, she packed up her belongings, put her life in boxes, and left Charlotte behind. She moved to a small town on the coast, hoping that the change of scenery would give her the fresh start she so desperately needed. She found a tiny apartment above a coffee shop, tucked away in a quiet corner of the world where no one knew her name and no one could hurt her. At first, the silence was deafening. She spent her days painting, walking along the beach, and reflecting on the choices that had brought her to this point. The ocean, with its vastness and its timeless rhythm, became her companion. It was as though the waves were speaking to her, reminding her that life, like the tide, could ebb and flow, but it would always move forward. She found peace in the small, simple moments, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees in the morning, the scent of coffee drifting through the air, the sound of birds calling to each other in the distance. It was the kind of peace she had longed for, a quietness that allowed her to rebuild herself piece by piece. But despite the tranquility of her new life, Alex couldn't escape the memories of Ryan. They lingered, persistent and haunting. She missed him in ways she couldn't fully explain. She missed the way his presence made her feel seen, the way he had understood her art and her pain in a way no one else had. But the more she thought about him, the more she realized that she couldn't go back. She couldn't let herself fall into the same cycle of hope and disappointment again. Ryan had made his choice, and so had she. And as much as it hurt, she knew she had to let him go. Meanwhile, Ryan was lost. The business project had taken a toll on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It had demanded everything from him: his time, his energy, his focus, and in the process, it had caused a rift in the one thing that had mattered most to him: his relationship with Alex. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Every conversation with his colleagues felt hollow. Every business deal seemed empty without her by his side. He had pushed her away, thinking that he could manage everything on his own, but now he realized that his life, despite its successes, was incomplete without her. He tried reaching out to her several times after their falling out, but each time, the distance between them seemed to grow. His messages went unanswered, his calls ignored. The guilt gnawed at him, but he refused to give up. He decided to find her, to explain himself, to make things right. He knew he had hurt her, and the last thing he wanted was to lose her forever. But when he finally tracked her down to the small coastal town, he was met with an unexpected response. When Alex saw him standing at the door of her apartment, his face etched with a mixture of hope and regret. Her heart twisted painfully in her chest. She had dreamed of this moment, the moment when he would come back, when they would find their way to each other again. But now that it was happening, she felt nothing but exhaustion. She had lived with the hurt, the confusion, and the loneliness for so long that she was no longer sure she had the strength to reopen that door. "I'm sorry, Alex," Ryan said, his voice raw, pleading. "I should have been there for you. I never meant to hurt you." But Alex just shook her head, her eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I can't do this anymore, Ryan," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "I can't keep living in the past. I've had to let go, and I need you to do the same." Ryan's heart sank. He wanted to argue, to explain, to make her understand. But deep down, he knew that this was her decision, one that she had made for herself. And though the pain of losing her was unbearable, he couldn't change it. "I'll always care about you," he whispered, his eyes meeting hers one last time. And with that, he turned away, leaving her to begin the life she had chosen for herself. As Alex watched him walk away, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. It hurt, but she knew it was the right choice. She had faced the truth of her own heart, and now she was free to move forward. The third crisis, the unexpected reunion. 1 year had passed since Alex left everything behind. The quiet coastal town she now called home had been a sanctuary, offering her the solitude she had so desperately craved. In the calm of her new life, Alex slowly began to piece herself together. Her art, once a refuge, became her voice, each stroke of paint a silent conversation with her soul. She was no longer the woman consumed by the hurt from her past. She was learning to be whole again, one day at a time. Yet, there were moments when the memories of Ryan, of their time together, would sneak up on her. The absence of his presence still felt like a void, but Alex had become accustomed to living with that emptiness. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon that fate decided to intervene. The town's annual book fair was in full swing, a bustling event that brought together authors, book lovers, and vendors from all around. Alex had agreed to attend, not out of a desire to see old faces, but because she had recently been invited to showcase her work at a local gallery. Her paintings had begun to garner some attention, and this event felt like a new step in her career. She never anticipated that it would be the day her past would come crashing back into her life. She was walking through the crowded aisles, her mind focused on the scent of fresh paper and the sound of people flipping through pages. It was a comforting atmosphere, one that reminded her of her old bookstore job, but now she saw it through different eyes that had learned to embrace new beginnings. That's when she saw him. Ryan stood a few feet away, standing near a bookstall, his back turned toward her. His tall frame and familiar silhouette made her heart skip a beat. She froze in place, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, time seemed to slow down as a rush of memories flooded her mind, the warmth of his embrace, the way he had made her laugh, the way they had once shared everything. But just as quickly, a bitter sting of anger and hurt rose within her chest. How dare he show up here? After everything? She stood rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do. Her first instinct was to turn and leave, to disappear into the crowd and avoid the confrontation. But something held her in place, something deeper than the resentment that had built up over the past year. She could feel her pulse quicken, her emotions rising to the surface, raw and unfiltered. Ryan, too, had sensed her presence. It wasn't just the familiar scent of her perfume or the way her footsteps had halted abruptly. It was the unmistakable tension in the air. He turned slowly, his gaze searching the crowd, and his eyes locked onto hers. For a brief moment, everything seemed to freeze. His heart ached with a kind of longing he hadn't felt in a long time. There she was, Alex, standing in front of him, looking as beautiful and strong as ever. The sight of her brought a flood of emotions he had spent the last year burying. He had tried to move on, to convince himself that he had made the right choice. But seeing her now, he realized how wrong he had been. His chest tightened as he took a hesitant step forward, unsure of how to approach her. Alex's gaze hardened, and she took a deep breath, her eyes flashing with a mix of anger and pain. She had made it clear to herself that she was done with him, that she would never allow him back in her life. And yet, here he was, standing before her as if nothing had changed. She forced herself to speak first, her voice colder than she intended. "I didn't expect to see you here, Ryan." He winced at the sharpness of her tone, but pressed on, his voice filled with a quiet sincerity. "Alex, I didn't know you were coming. I didn't expect to see you either. But I'm glad you're here." His words, though gentle, only seemed to fuel the fire that had been smoldering inside her. "You didn't expect to see me? How nice. It's been a year, Ryan. A year without a word. No phone calls, no apologies, nothing. And now you just show up as if you haven't been the reason I've spent the past 12 months trying to forget you." The bitterness in her voice took Ryan by surprise, but he didn't back down. He knew he deserved it. He deserved every ounce of her anger. He had walked away from her without explanation, prioritizing his career over their relationship, and he had left her to pick up the pieces alone. But seeing her again, the pain he had caused her weighed on him more than he could have imagined. He had made a mistake. "I know I hurt you," he said softly, "and I'll never be able to take that back. But seeing you here, it's like I never left. I never stopped thinking about you, Alex. You've always been in my heart, even when I try to push you out. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." For a moment, Alex didn't know how to respond. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for the first time in a long time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had learned something from his mistakes. But her mind quickly snapped back to reality. She had fought too hard to move on, to rebuild her life, to let him back in so easily. She looked at him, the anger and hurt in her eyes still evident. But beneath it, there was something else, a flicker of the love they once shared. She couldn't deny that part of her still cared for him, that part of her still wanted to believe in the man he had been before the mistakes, before the silence. But she had learned something important in the past year. She had learned how to stand on her own, how to live for herself, not for anyone else. She had finally found peace, and she wasn't willing to let that go just for the sake of a second chance. "I can't do this, Ryan," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've spent too long healing, too long building a life without you. I can't go back to what we were. I won't." Ryan's face fell, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. He had hoped, foolishly, that time and distance would erase the pain and bring them back together. But the truth was, he had lost her, he had lost the one person who mattered most. And this time, there was no turning back. Alex's gaze softened, but she held her ground. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Ryan, but I'm not it anymore." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, amidst the bustling crowd, with nothing but the echoes of her words ringing in his ears. As Alex walked through the fair, her heart ached, but she knew deep down that she had made the right choice. She had given everything to Ryan once before, and it had cost her. This time, she was choosing herself. The fourth crisis, tragedy, and growth. Ryan had always prided himself on being strong, on carrying his burdens alone without showing weakness. His career, his wealth, his life, everything had been meticulously crafted, each decision made with careful precision. But life, as it often does, has a way of throwing unexpected twists, and it was during one of the darkest moments in Ryan's life that he found himself at the mercy of his own vulnerability. It happened so suddenly. One evening, Ryan's father, a man who had once been the pillar of his family, succumbed to the devastating grip of cancer. The diagnosis had been quick, almost too fast for anyone to truly process, but the end came with a brutal finality. Ryan had always known that his father was ill. His visits to the hospital had become more frequent in the last few months, but he hadn't expected it to end this way. The pain of losing a parent, especially one so central to his identity, was like a heavy weight on Ryan's chest. He had always admired his father's stoic strength, the way he had built the family business from the ground up, and the way he had instilled in Ryan a sense of duty and responsibility. But with his father gone, that foundation seemed to crumble beneath him, and the walls he had so carefully built around his emotions began to crack. Ryan didn't know who else to turn to. His friends had their own lives, their own families, and his business partners, while sympathetic, could not offer the kind of solace he needed. His mother was beside herself with grief, and his younger siblings were still in shock, unable to truly process the loss. Ryan felt himself drowning in the sorrow, in the heaviness of the silence that followed his father's death. In the midst of his grief, there was one person he knew he could reach out to, the person he hadn't allowed himself to think about in so long, the person who had once made him feel truly understood, Alex. It wasn't easy. He had hurt her, betrayed her, and though time had passed, the wounds between them were still fresh. Ryan knew he couldn't just show up at her door uninvited, expecting comfort. He hesitated, uncertain whether she would even want to see him. But the weight of his grief was too much to bear alone. He needed someone to talk to, someone who could offer him even the smallest sense of peace in the storm of emotions that threatened to consume him. With a mix of fear and desperation, he called her. His voice trembled as he left the message, apologizing for everything that had happened between them, but explaining that he didn't know where else to go. He asked, almost pleading, if she could meet him, if she could just listen. When Alex received Ryan's message, her first reaction was one of disbelief. After everything that had happened, the way he had shut her out, the hurt he had caused her, she wasn't sure she could be the person he needed her to be. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life, to move forward from the pain of their past. And now, here he was, asking her for help. The emotions swirled within her: anger, resentment, confusion. But there was also something else, something softer that she had buried deep down: empathy. She had always known that Ryan carried his own burdens, his own demons, even if he never showed it. And the truth was, despite everything, she still cared for him. She still loved him in a way that she couldn't easily erase. But the decision wasn't just about her feelings. It was about what was right. Alex knew that Ryan's grief was consuming him, and though their relationship was broken, she couldn't stand by and watch him suffer alone. So, she agreed to meet him. The next day, they sat in a small cafe by the beach, the same place where they had shared their first long conversation months ago. The air was cool, a soft breeze carrying the scent of salt water, but the atmosphere between them was anything but peaceful. Ryan sat across from Alex, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked older, weary, as though the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. "I don't know how to do this," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could handle it all on my own, but I can't. I've lost him, Alex. I don't even know who I am without him." Alex listened quietly, her gaze softening. She had heard these words before, in different forms, from different people, men and women alike, grieving the loss of someone they loved. But this was different. This was Ryan, the man who had once held her heart, the man who had walked away without a word, now sitting in front of her, vulnerable and broken. "I'm sorry," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I messed up. I didn't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it now. Not just for what happened between us, but for everything. I've been running away from everything, my past, my mistakes, and even from you. But I can't run anymore. I need to face it. I need to face you." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Alex took a long breath before she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with the hurt of their shared history. "You don't just get to come back, Ryan. You don't get to break me and then expect everything to fall back into place because you've had a hard time. You left, and I've had to rebuild my life without you. I moved on, and I can't just go back to the way things were." There was silence between them. The weight of her words settled on Ryan's chest like a stone. He understood now, more than ever, the depth of the hurt he had caused. This wasn't just about asking for forgiveness. This was about acknowledging the damage he had done and giving Alex the space she needed to heal, even if it meant losing her forever. "I don't want to go back to how things were," he said finally. "I want to build something new, something better. But I understand if you can't, if you don't want that." And in that moment, Alex knew something had shifted between them. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but the future no longer seemed impossible. They could never go back, but maybe, just maybe, they could move forward, not as they once were, but as two people who had learned from their mistakes. True love. The weeks following Ryan's father's death were a turning point in both his and Alex's lives. What began as an unexpected reunion, a simple meeting born out of grief and unresolved pain, slowly transformed into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated. Their encounters became more frequent, and with each passing day, they found themselves sharing parts of their lives that had once been buried deep within their hearts. The layers of resentment, the walls of distrust, and the silence that had existed between them for so long began to crumble, not all at once, but gradually, piece by piece. Ryan's grief had been a catalyst for their reconnection, but it was their shared vulnerability, their willingness to face the truth about their past, that allowed them to heal. In the quiet moments they spent together, whether it was sitting on a park bench, walking along the beach, or simply talking over coffee, they began to rediscover the connection they had once shared. But this time it was different. Neither Alex nor Ryan could deny the chemistry between them, the unspoken bond that had always existed. But they also knew that love was no longer about the initial rush of excitement, the thrill of new beginnings. It was something much deeper, something that required honesty, patience, and a willingness to face the hard truths about themselves and each other. In their conversations, they shared their fears and insecurities. Alex confessed how deeply the betrayal had wounded her, how she had closed herself off from love out of fear of being hurt again. Ryan admitted his own flaws, how he had pushed her away, believing that he needed to maintain control, that vulnerability was a weakness. And yet, despite everything they had been through, despite the wounds they both carried, they realized that the love they had once shared had never truly disappeared. It had simply been buried under layers of pride, hurt, and misunderstanding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Ryan turned to Alex, his voice filled with a kind of raw honesty that he had never shown before. "I was wrong," he said softly. "I thought I had to protect myself from the world, from you. But in doing that, I pushed you away. And I see now that I lost someone more important than anything I've ever had." Alex's heart ached as she listened to his words. She had heard apologies before, empty words that had done little to heal the wounds in her heart. But this time, there was something different in his tone, a sincerity that resonated deep within her. She knew that Ryan had struggled with his own demons, his own fears of vulnerability. She had seen it in the way he had built walls around himself, in the way he had tried to control everything in his life. But now, here he was, standing before her, acknowledging his mistakes. "I wasn't perfect either," Alex replied, her voice shaky but steady. "I held on to the pain for too long. I pushed you away too. But I can't keep carrying all that anger. I can't keep holding on to the past." They stood in silence for a moment, the world around them fading away as they simply existed in each other's presence. The weight of everything that had happened, the pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, felt lighter somehow. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer an insurmountable obstacle. They had both faced it, and in doing so, they had come to understand that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about never making mistakes or never feeling hurt. True love, they realized, was about acceptance, about embracing each other's flaws, fears, and scars, and choosing to move forward together, despite the pain. As the days turned into weeks, their relationship continued to blossom, but this time it was grounded in something much more stable than before. There was no rush, no pressure. They took their time, slowly rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. They laughed together, shared quiet moments, and began to heal in ways they had never imagined. And slowly, as they grew closer, they realized that they had the opportunity to create something beautiful, a future together. But their healing wasn't just about the two of them. It was about the future they could build, one that included more than just their love. As they talked about what they wanted out of life, they found themselves discussing the possibility of children, of nurturing a family together. The thought was still new, still tentative, but it filled them both with a sense of hope that they hadn't felt in a long time. For Alex, the idea of motherhood had always been a distant dream, one that she had set aside after her painful divorce. She had convinced herself that love wasn't meant for her, that perhaps she wasn't meant to build a family. But with Ryan, the dream of a family felt real again. He was no longer the man who had abandoned her. He was the man who had come back, not just for himself, but for them, for their future. Ryan, too, had always been focused on his career, on building a legacy that he could leave behind. He had never imagined that his legacy would include a family. But as he watched Alex's eyes light up at the possibility of future together, he realized that this was the life he wanted. Not just the success, not just the business, but the love and the joy that came with building something meaningful with someone he cared about. Together, they began to dream about the life they would create. They would raise children in a home filled with love, a home where both of them could contribute their strengths, where Alex's creativity and Ryan's wisdom would come together to nurture a new generation. They would show their children the importance of forgiveness, of acceptance, of love that doesn't demand perfection but embraces imperfection. They would teach them that true love wasn't about avoiding pain, but about learning how to heal and grow together. As they made plans for their future, Alex and Ryan knew that their journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. They had faced their darkest moments, had weathered the storms of betrayal and grief, and had come out stronger on the other side. Now, they were ready to step into a new chapter of their lives, hand in hand, ready to face whatever challenges life would throw at them. They had learned that true love wasn't about finding someone who was perfect, but about finding someone who was willing to grow with you, to heal with you, and to love you flaws and all. And in each other, they had found that love. Happiness and peace in the months following their heartfelt reconciliation, Alex and Ryan's relationship blossomed in a way neither of them had ever expected. What began as a tentative rebuilding of trust, rooted in shared vulnerability, gradually evolved into a love that was grounded in understanding and acceptance. They had learned that love was not about perfection, but about finding beauty in the flaws and imperfections of life in each other. It wasn't an easy road. There were moments of doubt, times when old fears resurfaced, and the weight of past hurts threatened to pull them apart. But in those moments, they had each other to lean on. They were no longer the people who had been scarred by betrayal and loss. They were two individuals who had come together to build something stronger, something more enduring. Ryan had once believed that happiness was about success, about achieving everything he had set his mind to, about building an empire and maintaining control over every aspect of his life. But through his relationship with Alex, he learned that true happiness wasn't found in wealth or status. It was found in the quiet moments of connection, in the way they could share their fears and dreams with each other without judgment, in the way they could be vulnerable together and still find strength. For Alex, the journey had been equally transformative. She had once feared that love would always lead to heartbreak, that she would always be left behind. But with Ryan, she learned that love was about growth, about healing, and about forgiving not just the other person, but herself. She had spent so much time trying to protect herself from pain that she had forgotten how to let herself fully experience the joy of being loved. Ryan had shown her that it was okay to be imperfect, that it was okay to make mistakes, and that it was okay to trust again. Their wedding, a small but intimate ceremony surrounded by close friends and family, was a symbol of everything they had fought for: their love, their resilience, and their commitment to each other. As they stood together, exchanging vows in the soft glow of the setting sun, they knew that their journey had only just begun. The road ahead would not always be smooth, but they were ready to face it hand in hand. They spoke their vows with sincerity, their voices steady and filled with emotion. "I promise to love you, not just for who you are, but for who I am when I'm with you," Ryan said, his words carrying the weight of everything he had learned over the past year. "I promise to stand by you through the good and the bad, and to always fight for us." Alex's eyes glistened as she held his gaze. "I promise to be there for you, to support you, to never give up on us," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I promise to love you, even when we face challenges, because I know that together we are stronger." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the crowd erupted in applause, but to Alex and Ryan, the world seemed to fade away. In that moment, there was only the two of them, and the sense of peace that came from knowing they had found something real, something worth fighting for. Their life together wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. They had built something beautiful, a relationship grounded in trust, communication, and unconditional love. There were still challenges ahead, of course. No relationship was without its difficulties. But now, they faced them not as two individuals struggling to survive, but as a team stronger together than they had ever been apart. As the years passed, they created a life full of memories. They traveled, they laughed, and yes, they argued, because even the happiest of marriages aren't without conflict. But what set them apart was their willingness to always come back to each other, to never let the small things tear them apart. They learned the art of compromise, of listening without judgment, and of holding space for each other's growth. They also built a family, a home filled with love and warmth. Children came into their lives, each one a reflection of the love they had nurtured. Parenthood brought its own set of challenges, but it also brought a deeper sense of fulfillment. Watching their children grow, learning to navigate the world with curiosity and wonder, gave them a new sense of purpose. It was a reminder that love, when nurtured, could create something lasting, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Alex and Ryan had come a long way from the broken individuals they once were. They had faced their demons, they had healed their wounds, and now they had found peace. They had learned that life would never be perfect, but as long as they had each other, they could weather any storm. Their love was not a fairy tale. It was something real, something hard-won. And in that reality, they had found the happiness and peace they had both been searching for all along. As they sat together on the porch one quiet evening, watching the sunset and holding hands, Alex turned to Ryan and smiled. "We made it," she said softly. Ryan squeezed her hand and smiled back. "We did, and I'll keep fighting for this for us for as long as I'm breathing." In that moment, they both knew that whatever life threw their way, they were ready to face it together. And in that certainty, they found the truest form of happiness: peace, love, and the knowledge that no matter what, they would never have to face the world alone again. Welcome to Stories TH channel. Today, we will dive into a love story full of challenges, but also sweet and emotional moments. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel to follow more exciting videos.